He was just a tired night shift worker walking home with his German shepherd, and she was just a young cleaning girl everyone chose to ignore. When a powerful man humiliated her in public, the street went silent and people looked away. He didn't have money, he didn't have influence, and he didn't come looking for a fight. All he had was a choice, to walk away or to stay. This is not a story about winning a fight. It's a story about faith, quiet courage, and a miracle that came without noise. If you believe God still works through ordinary people, stay with us. And don't forget to subscribe. Late morning heat clung to the city like a damp blanket, the air thick with dust, metal, and old brick, as Charleston drifted through another ordinary day, unaware that something small but irreversible was about to begin. Mark Turner finished his maintenance shift just before noon, wiping his hands on a rag already darkened by grease and rust. At 46, he carried his years not in wrinkles but in posture, shoulders slightly forward as if bracing against an invisible weight, spine stiff from decades of physical labor and older habits learned in places he never spoke about. He stood just under 6 feet tall, broad through the chest but lean everywhere else, his strength functional rather than showy. His face was angular, weathered by sun and exhaustion, with a permanent shadow of stubble along his jaw that no amount of sleep ever seemed to erase. His hair, once dark brown, had begun to gray at the temples, cropped short out of habit more than vanity. Mark's eyes were a muted hazel, the kind that looked calm until you studied them long enough to notice how rarely they stopped scanning. Beside him walked Rex, a 4-year-old German shepherd with a deep sable coat and intelligent amber eyes dulled slightly by age beyond his years. Rex moved with discipline, his shoulder aligned with Mark's knee, but his right hind leg dragged just enough to be noticeable if you were looking for it. The limp was old, the result of shrapnel and a rushed extraction years ago. It never fully healed, and on humid days like this, it stiffened. Rex didn't whine. He never did. He simply adjusted his gait and kept going, loyalty overriding discomfort. His ears twitched constantly, cataloging the world, passing cars, raised voices, distant sirens. Despite his size, there was something restrained about him, as if power lived inside him but waited for permission to exist. Mark liked walking after his shifts. It helped him transition from the mechanical world of broken pipes and flickering lights back into something resembling civilian life. He passed renovated storefronts and old buildings caught between decay and gentrification, the city wearing its contradictions openly. When he turned onto a narrower street, he noticed the sound first, a sharp, cutting voice that didn't belong to casual conversation. The building was impossible to miss. Iron Crown Combat. Matte black paint swallowed the historic brick beneath it, the sign angular and aggressive, like a challenge rather than an invitation. Parked illegally in front was a silver sports coupe, polished to a mirror shine. Standing beside it was Derek Vaughn. Derek Vaughn was 39, tall and thick through the arms, his physique inflated by gym routines more focused on appearance than endurance. His skin carried an artificial bronze tone that clashed with the natural light, and his dark hair was slicked back with more product than necessary, every strand locked into place. His face was square, heavy in the jaw, with a perpetual smirk that suggested he believed the world existed to test his patience. He wore a fitted black shirt emblazoned with his gym's logo, sleeves rolled to display his biceps, and expensive training pants paired with pristine sneakers that had never touched dirt. In front of him stood Hannah Collins. Hannah looked barely 23, slight and narrow-shouldered, her posture already conditioned to apology. She was dressed in a gray custodial uniform, 2 sizes too large, the fabric hanging from her frame as if borrowed. Her brown hair was pulled into a messy bun that refused to stay neat, strands escaping to cling to her forehead. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, with faint dark circles beneath her eyes that spoke of short nights and longer worries. She clutched the handle of a yellow mop bucket tipped on its side, soapy water pooling across the sidewalk. A few droplets had splashed onto the rim of Derek's wheel. Derek wasn't hitting her. That was the part people would later use to excuse themselves. Instead, he stood too close, blocking her path, leaning forward so his shadow swallowed her. His voice was loud, sharp, designed to humiliate rather than instruct. He called her careless, stupid, useless. He demanded to know how much she earned, sneering as if the number itself offended him. Hannah kept nodding, murmuring apologies that never seemed to be the right ones. Each word made her shrink further into herself. A couple walking past slowed, exchanged glances, then continued on. A man waiting for a rideshare checked his phone and turned away. The moment hung there, ugly and unresolved, the kind of everyday cruelty that survived precisely because it didn't look dramatic enough to interrupt a schedule. Mark stopped. Rex felt it immediately and sat, his body going still, eyes locked on Derek. Mark's pulse didn't spike. It narrowed. He took in the distance, the angle, the lack of witnesses willing to step closer. He smelled detergent, hot asphalt, and something familiar beneath it all. Fear. Mark stepped off the curb. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't rush. When he spoke, it was with the calm certainty of someone who had learned long ago that volume was not authority. "She apologized," he said. "That's enough." Derek turned, startled more by interruption than tone. His eyes flicked over Mark's worn boots, his oil-stained shirt, the dog. He laughed, a short bark meant to establish hierarchy. "This isn't your problem, old man," Derek said. "Mind your business." Mark didn't respond to the insult. He looked at Hannah instead, saw the way her hands were trembling, the effort it took for her to remain standing. He knew that look. He'd worn it himself once, in a different context, under different skies. Derek followed his gaze and scoffed. "She damaged my property," he said louder, as if performing for an invisible audience. "You think sorry fixes that?" "Water dries," Mark replied. "People don't." That was when Derek noticed Rex properly. The dog hadn't moved, but his chest vibrated with a low, controlled growl, not a threat, not an attack, just a warning. It was quiet enough that only those close could hear it. Derek took half a step back before he realized he had done it. His smile faltered, then hardened into something resentful. "Control your mutt," Derek snapped. "He is controlled," Mark said. His hand rested lightly on Rex's head, fingers brushing the coarse fur. Rex settled, but his eyes never left Derek. Something in Derek shifted. Being challenged in public, even subtly, triggered a familiar reflex. He straightened, puffed out his chest. "You think you're tough?" he said. "You think you can judge me?" Mark finally met his eyes. There was no anger there, only a boundary. "I think you're done here." A few seconds passed. Derek looked around, noticed the phones that had appeared, the attention he hadn't commanded but was now forced to share. He grinned again, but it was tight, performative. "Fine," he said. "If you think I'm wrong, come prove it. Tomorrow, on my mat. No dog, no excuses." The challenge hung in the air, unnecessary and inevitable. Mark didn't answer immediately. He looked at Hannah. She was staring at the ground, shoulders hunched, as if already bracing for consequences. He understood with painful clarity that if he walked away now, Derek wouldn't forget. Men like Derek never did. They waited, then collected. Mark nodded once. "I'll be there," he said. Derek laughed, relief disguised as bravado. "Good. Don't be late." As Mark turned away, Rex rose and fell back into step beside him. Behind them, Derek resumed talking loudly, reclaiming his space. But something had changed. He had been forced to step back, if only for a moment. Hannah remained frozen, the mop bucket still overturned. Mark stopped after a few steps and looked back. "You okay?" he asked quietly. She nodded, though it was a lie born of habit. Mark knew it, and Rex knew it too. The dog glanced at her once before following Mark down the street, the quiet growl fading, but not forgotten. The call came just after 4 in the afternoon, when the day was cooling, but the heat hadn't fully let go. Hannah Collins stood in the narrow office of the property management suite, the air smelling faintly of copier toner and old carpet cleaner. Her hands folded tightly in front of her. as if holding herself together might keep the moment from breaking her apart. Roger Fields, the building supervisor, sat behind a desk that felt too large for him. He was a thin man in his late 50s, balding on top with wisps of gray hair clinging stubbornly to the sides, his wire-rimmed glasses sliding down a nose made shiny with nervous sweat. Roger avoided eye contact as he spoke, his voice soft, apologetic, and completely final. There had been a complaint, he said, a serious one. A tenant felt unsafe, liability issues. Hannah heard the words but not their order. They stacked on top of each other until all she understood was the conclusion. Her badge was taken. Her keys were collected. She was asked to clear out her locker immediately. There was no accusation she could defend against, because nothing specific was being accused. When she tried to explain, Roger lifted his palms helplessly, a man practiced in surrender. "I'm sorry," he repeated, and meant it in the way people mean it when they have already decided not to help. Hannah nodded, thanked him out of reflex, and walked out carrying a cardboard box that suddenly felt heavier than it should have. By the time evening arrived, the temperature had dropped enough for the breeze to carry a chill. Hannah sat at the bus stop 2 blocks from the building, the metal bench cold through the thin fabric of her uniform pants. Her box rested at her feet, containing a framed photograph of her mother smiling from a hospital bed, a spare pair of gloves, and a paperback romance novel with a creased spine. She hugged her arms around herself, not entirely sure whether she was shaking from the cold or from the delayed impact of fear finally catching up. The bus schedule above her head rattled in the wind, mocking her with destinations she no longer knew how to reach. Rent was due in 4 days. Her mother's prescription refill was due in 3. She counted the cash in her wallet twice, as if the number might change if she tried hard enough. She didn't hear Mark Turner approach at first. Rex noticed before she did, lifting his head from his resting position, ears swiveling forward, his body alert but not tense. Mark slowed as he saw her, recognizing the slumped posture and the familiar weight of defeat in the way she held herself. He stopped a few steps away, giving her space, the same courtesy he'd once wished someone would give him when the world had closed in too tightly. "They let you go," he said, not as a question. Hannah looked up, startled, then nodded. Her eyes were red, her lashes clumped together where tears had dried. "They said it was out of their hands," she replied. Her voice didn't shake anymore. It had gone flat, a sign she was conserving what little energy she had left. "I have to be out of my apartment if I can't pay by Tuesday." Mark absorbed that quietly. He leaned back against the glass panel of the bus shelter, the old habit of grounding himself kicking in. He thought about his own truck, parked 3 streets away, its engine light flickering on again that morning. He thought about the overdue notice tucked into his wallet, the one he pretended not to see. He did the math automatically and came up short, as he always did. Rex shifted, then slowly and deliberately lay down at Hannah's feet. It was an unusual choice for him. Rex was cautious with strangers, especially when emotions ran high. He stretched out fully, his flank rising and falling with a steady breath, his head resting near her worn sneakers. When Hannah glanced down, confused, he didn't look up at her. He simply stayed. After a moment, she hesitantly reached out and rested her hand on his back. His muscles tensed, just for a second, then softened. A faint tremor ran through him, the kind that came from memory rather than cold, but he didn't pull away. "He does that when he thinks someone needs anchoring," Mark said quietly. "Helps him too." Hannah managed a small, broken smile. "He's kind," she said, surprised by how much she meant it. "Most days," Mark replied. They sat there for a while, the city moving around them. A woman waiting for the next bus paced nearby, tapping at her phone. A teenage boy skateboarded past, earbuds in, oblivious. Life, indifferent and persistent. "My mom's sick," Hannah said eventually, the words spilling out now that the silence had proven safe. "Congestive heart failure. She needs oxygen at night. The medication is—" I was barely keeping up. She swallowed hard. I didn't tell my boss because I didn't want special treatment. I just needed the schedule. Mark nodded. He didn't say he understood. He let her speak. I have $43, she continued, almost laughing. That's it. Mark exhaled slowly. He thought of all the times people had offered him sympathy when what he'd needed was something sturdier. He turned to face her fully. I'm not going to insult you by pretending I can fix this with cash, he said. I can't. I'm short myself. Hannah's shoulders sagged, but she didn't look disappointed. If anything, she seemed relieved to hear a truth that didn't require pretending. But, Mark went on, I can promise you this won't just disappear. What he did today doesn't get to be the end of the story. She studied his face, searching for exaggeration, for false confidence. She found none. Just a tired man standing anyway. You don't even know me, she said softly. I know enough, Mark replied. And I know what happens when people like him think no one's watching. The bus arrived then, doors hissing open. Hannah didn't move to board it. She looked at Rex one last time, her hand lingering on his fur, grounding herself in the warmth. When she stood, she looked steadier than she had an hour before. Thank you, she said. For earlier. For now. Mark gave a small nod. I'll be there tomorrow, he said. Not because I'm sure I'll win, just because walking away would be worse. Hannah watched him go, Rex limping slightly but proudly at his side. For the first time since the call from the office, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't safety. It was smaller than that. It was the sense that she wasn't invisible anymore, and for tonight, that was enough. The morning after the bus stop felt ordinary in the way hard days often do, quiet and stubborn, as if the city had decided not to acknowledge what was beginning to stir beneath its surface. Mark Turner woke early in his rented room, the ceiling fan clicking unevenly above him. Rex already awake on the thin rug by the door. The dog's ears twitched at every hallway sound, not fear exactly, but vigilance shaped by habit. Mark brewed coffee strong enough to bite back, then laced his boots with the slow care of a man who knew he would be on his feet all day. He didn't have a plan in the military sense. He had something less impressive and more honest: time, patience, and a willingness to listen. He started at the corner diner 2 blocks from Iron Crown Combat, a narrow place wedged between a nail salon and a closed dry cleaner, its windows fogged with grease and history. The Liberty Spoon had been there longer than most of the new businesses, surviving by refusing to change too much. Behind the counter stood Frank Delgado, a man in his early 70s with a body that had shrunk but not softened. Frank was short and compact, his shoulders permanently squared as if bracing against wind. His hair was white and thin, combed back with water, and a gray mustache rested above a mouth that rarely smiled but often listened. A faded tattoo peeked from beneath his rolled sleeve, an anchor entwined with initials, its lines blurred by time. Frank walked with a slight limp from a knee that never recovered after a fall on a ship deck decades earlier, and it lent him a patience born of pain. Frank noticed Rex first. He nodded once, approval silent but clear. "Working dog," he said, not asking. "Used to be," Mark replied. Frank poured coffee without being asked and slid it across the counter. "That gym owner's trouble," he said, voice low. "Always has been." They talked in fragments between customers and orders. Frank didn't dramatize. He didn't need to. He spoke of envelopes dropped off monthly, labeled as security coordination, of how he paid it first, because broken windows cost more than pride, of the bakery that refused and closed 3 months later after a string of inspections and fines. Frank's eyes hardened as he spoke, but his voice stayed steady. "Men like him," he said, "they don't hit first, they squeeze." Mark thanked him and left a few bills on the counter. Frank pushed them back halfway. "For later," he said. "You'll need it." Outside, Mark walked the block slowly. He didn't stare at Iron Crown combat. He watched the people who went in and out, mothers with tired faces and oversized tote bags, fathers checking their watches, children in mismatched uniforms, belts tied too neatly for how little they seemed to enjoy wearing them. One woman lingered by the door, arguing softly with a teenage assistant over a clipboard. Her name was Sarah Bennett, Mark would learn later. She was in her mid-30s, tall and thin, with a posture worn down by long shifts. Her blonde hair pulled into a low ponytail, already streaked with sweat despite the early hour. Her skin was fair and freckled, and there was a deep crease between her brows that came from years of calculating bills in her head. She worked nights as a nurse's aide, she said when Mark eventually spoke to her, and the gym's contract was the only place that promised her son structure while she slept. Promised was the word she used, not gave. Sarah showed him the paperwork folded and refolded in her bag, the corners soft from worry. 36 months, no cancellation, fees for rank advancement scheduled regardless of attendance. I thought it was normal, she said quietly. He said discipline cost something. Mark didn't correct her. He thanked her for showing him. Rex stayed close as they moved, his body language shifting subtly whenever they passed the alley behind the gym. He didn't pull or bark. He slowed, head lowered, nose working overtime. There was a sharpness in the air there, a chemical tang that didn't belong to sweat or cleaning supplies. Rex's ears flattened, his pace quickening only once they were past it. Mark noticed, filed it away, resisted the urge to make it more than it was. Instinct was not evidence, but it was a place to start asking better questions. At the public library that afternoon, Mark took a seat at a terminal near the window, Rex lying beneath the desk with his chin on his paws. The library smelled of paper and dust, a comforting neutrality. Mark searched open records, not digging deep enough to trespass, just far enough to confirm a pattern. It took longer than he expected. Names changed, affiliations blurred, but eventually, there it was. A disciplinary notice buried in a regional association archive. Derek Vaughn, revocation of certification, financial misconduct, misrepresentation of rank, dated 5 years earlier. The language was dry, bureaucratic, but its meaning was sharp. Derek was not what he claimed to be. Mark printed the page. The printer whined and stalled before spitting it out like a reluctant confession. He folded the paper carefully, aware of how small it felt for the weight it carried. As the day wore on, he returned to the diner once more, then to the bus stop where Hannah had been the night before. She wasn't there now. He didn't expect her to be. This wasn't about rescuing someone in a single moment. It was about making sure the ground under her feet stopped shifting. By evening, Mark had a thin stack of paper in his jacket and the beginnings of something else he hadn't anticipated. Names, faces, a quiet understanding shared between people who had thought they were alone in their frustration. None of them asked him what he planned to do. They didn't need to. The act of speaking had already changed something. Rex walked beside him as the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the brick. The dog paused once, looking back toward the alley, then forward again, choosing movement over fear. Mark mirrored the decision. There was no decisive strike waiting at the end of this day, no guarantee of success, just a collection of small truths gathered patiently, held together by people who had finally decided not to look away. And for the first time since Derek's voice had cut through the street, that felt like enough to keep going. The cheap motel room smelled faintly of bleach and old cigarette smoke, the kind of place that had learned to survive by being forgettable. The neon sign outside buzzed and flickered, casting intermittent red light through the thin curtains. Mark Turner lay on top of the covers fully dressed, boots unlaced but still on his feet, staring at a hairline crack in the ceiling that ran like a fault line from one corner to the other. It reminded him of how things broke slowly, not all at once. Rex lay on the floor near the door, his body curled but tense, ears lifting at every sound that drifted in from the hallway. Rex was not sleeping. He rarely did in unfamiliar places. His breathing was shallow, controlled, and every few minutes his paws twitched as if he were bracing for impact that never came. The old injury in his hind legs stiffened when he lay too long on the thin carpet, forcing him to shift position again and again. When someone laughed loudly outside, Rex's head snapped up, a low woof escaping his chest before he caught himself. Mark noticed. He always noticed. "You're okay," Mark murmured, more for himself than the dog. He reached down, resting his palm against Rex's rib cage until the breathing slowed. Rex leaned into the touch, pressing his head briefly against Mark's knee before returning to his watchful position by the door. The roles had reversed without ceremony. Once, Rex had been the shield that allowed Mark to sleep. Tonight, Mark was trying to be that shield for Rex, even though he felt anything but solid. Mark's phone sat on the nightstand, screen dark, no missed calls, no messages. Hannah hadn't reached out, and he was glad for it. He didn't want to offer reassurances he wasn't sure he could keep. He replayed the day in his mind instead. Frank's steady voice at the diner, Sarah Bennett's trembling hands holding a contract she didn't understand until it was too late, the thin printed notice from the library folded in his jacket pocket. None of it was enough to guarantee anything. Truth didn't always win. Sometimes it just showed up and got ignored. A sharp knock echoed suddenly through the hallway, followed by muffled laughter. Rex rose instantly, muscles taut, but Mark lifted a finger, signaling restraint. The knock came again, harder this time, directly against their door. A slurred voice called out an apology that sounded insincere, even through drunken haze. Mark stayed silent. After a moment, the footsteps staggered away, the noise dissolving into more laughter down the corridor. Rex remained standing, hackles raised, until the sounds faded completely. Mark exhaled slowly and sat up on the edge of the bed. His hands trembled just enough to irritate him. He clenched them, then forced himself to relax. He had faced worse nights than this, nights when the walls shook and sleep was a luxury no one expected. Still, this felt different. Tomorrow wasn't about survival, it was about consequence, and consequences were unpredictable in a way bullets were not. He thought of Hannah sitting on that cold bus bench, her eyes empty with exhaustion rather than tears. He thought of how easily things could get worse for her if he failed publicly. Derek Vaughn would not forgive embarrassment. Men like Derek converted humiliation into cruelty with frightening efficiency. The realization pressed down on Mark's chest until breathing felt deliberate rather than automatic. "Maybe this is a mistake," Mark said aloud, testing the words. Rex turned his head slightly, ears flicking, listening without judgment. Mark stood and paced the small room, counting steps, grounding himself in the physical reality of chipped paint and threadbare carpet. He stopped by the window and pulled the curtain back just enough to see the parking lot below. His truck sat under a broken streetlight, its faded blue paint dulled further by dust. The sight of it brought an unexpected wave of weariness. He was tired of fighting, tired of choosing between silence and consequence. For a moment, the temptation to walk away felt almost reasonable. He could skip town. He could let Derek keep his kingdom of lies. He could tell himself that one girl's misfortune wasn't his responsibility. The thought lingered just long enough to feel dangerous. Rex moved then, slowly pushing himself upright despite the stiffness in his leg. He crossed the room and rested his head against Mark's thigh, applying gentle, insistent pressure. Mark froze. Rex's ears were relaxed now, his posture open, vulnerable in a way he rarely allowed himself to be. When Mark sank back down onto the bed, Rex climbed awkwardly onto the edge and placed his head against Mark's chest, right over his heart. The contact was heavy and grounding, warm through layers of fabric. Rex let out a quiet sigh, the sound of an animal choosing trust over vigilance. Mark closed his eyes. His breathing steadied, the noise in his head softened. He rested his hand on Rex's neck, feeling the steady pulse there. The dog had followed him through worse than this without knowing why. He deserved honesty in return. "I don't know if I can win," Mark whispered, "but I won't lie." Rex's tail thumped once, faintly, as if the answer had been enough. The night dragged on, but it no longer felt endless. Mark returned to the bed, sitting with his back against the headboard. Rex settled beside him instead of by the door. They dozed in fragments, waking and resting, neither fully asleep nor fully alert. When morning light finally seeped through the curtains, pale and unassuming, Mark felt the decision settle into place with quiet certainty. He showered quickly, the water lukewarm at best, scrubbing away the grease and the doubt with equal determination. He pulled on a clean shirt, threadbare but neat, and checked the folded papers in his jacket one last time. Rex stretched carefully, testing his leg, then stood ready. His eyes were clear now, focused. Whatever happened later that day would happen in the open. Mark had chosen that much. He knelt briefly, pressing his forehead to Rex's. "We tell the truth," he said. "That's all." Rex didn't growl, he didn't bark. He simply stood, steady and present, a quiet witness to a choice made not out of strength, but out of refusal to abandon what was right. And when they stepped out into the early morning air, neither of them looked back. The room inside Iron Crown Combat felt smaller than it had the day before, stripped of bravado and noise, reduced to bare mats, fluorescent lights, and the collective breath of people who had come not for spectacle, but for an answer. There was no music playing, no spotlight, no announcer, just the hum of the lights and the faint smell of disinfectant layered over old sweat. Mark Turner stepped onto the mat quietly, dressed in the same plain clothes he wore to work, faded jeans, a clean but worn shirt, boots scuffed at the toes. He looked like what he was, a man from the laboring world who had come straight from real life. Rex stayed near the wall, lying down where Mark had pointed earlier, his head up, his body relaxed but attentive, a presence rather than a threat. Derek Vaughn arrived moments later with the confidence of someone who had never learned to doubt himself. He wore a crisp black training uniform with red stitching, his belt tied perfectly, his movements exaggerated and loose. Up close, the sharp angles of his face looked tighter than before. His jaw clenched, the skin around his eyes drawn thin by a sleepless night he would never admit to. Derek had built his personality around domination. Years of unchecked authority over children and intimidated adults had taught him that volume and aggression passed for strength. Today, that certainty flickered just slightly when he noticed how many parents were present, how close they stood to the mat, how quiet they were. Among them was Sarah Bennett, tall and narrow-framed, her blonde hair braided loosely down her back, dark circles under her eyes from another night shift she hadn't slept off. She stood with her arms crossed, protective and tense, her son half hidden behind her hip. Near the entrance, Frank Delgado leaned on his cane, his lined face unreadable, watching with the patience of someone who had waited decades to see certain things corrected. And near the far wall stood Hannah Collins, hands clasped tightly in front of her, shoulders squared in a way that would have been impossible just days earlier. She wore borrowed clothes that fit her better than her old uniform ever had, and though her face was pale, her eyes were steady. No one explained the rules. They didn't need to. Derek stepped forward first, fists raised, breath already loud. Mark waited, feet planted, shoulders loose. When Derek attacked, it was fast and angry, a series of heavy swings meant to overwhelm rather than connect. Mark moved just enough, slipping to the side, redirecting force, letting momentum burn itself out. He didn't strike back with flair. He closed distance, locked joints, guided Derek off balance, then released. Again and again. The sound in the room was not cheering, but breathing. Derek's growing ragged gasps, the quiet intake of air from the people watching as they began to understand what they were seeing. It ended not with a final blow, but with exhaustion. Derek lunged one last time, misjudged his footing and stumbled to his knees. Mark caught him reflexively, not to hurt him, but to keep him from hitting the mat face first. For a moment, neither man moved. Then Derek pulled free, backing away, chest heaving, eyes wild with humiliation rather than pain. He had lost not because he was beaten down, but because he could not control himself long enough to stand. Mark stepped back. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't look to the crowd. He simply nodded once, as if concluding a difficult conversation. Rex remained still, as if the moment required respect rather than triumph. Mark reached into his jacket and pulled out the folded papers, edges softened from being handled too often. He turned toward the parents, his voice calm but clear. "If I'm wrong," he said, "you don't owe me anything. Forget this happened." He paused, then continued. "But if I'm right, don't stay quiet just because it's easier." He handed the papers to the nearest parent, a man with tired eyes and a permanent crease between his brows, who read silently, then passed them on. Murmurs began. Confusion, recognition, anger. Frank Delgado spoke next, his voice steady and unhurried as he described the envelopes, the fees, the pressure. Others followed. Sarah's voice shook when she spoke, but she didn't stop. She talked about contracts she couldn't escape, money she couldn't afford, and the fear of pulling her son out and leaving him with nothing. Finally, someone asked Hannah to step forward. She did, slowly, standing in the center of the mat that had frightened her once. She didn't look at Derek. She looked at the people. "I don't want revenge," she said quietly. "I just want to work without being scared. I want to go home knowing I did my job and that it's enough." No one interrupted her. Even Derek had gone silent, the space around him widening as if the room itself had rejected him. What followed did not feel dramatic. There were no arrests that day, no shouted accusations. People left with copies of documents, phone numbers exchanged, promises made cautiously but sincerely. Over the next weeks, those promises became action. Complaints were filed, records reviewed. The gym was investigated, its practices examined in the unglamorous light of paperwork and procedure. Derek Vaughn was charged with fraud and coercive contracting, his authority stripped away not in a single moment, but piece by piece, until nothing remained but the man himself. Hannah was offered her job back by the building management, this time with an apology that came from more than fear. She was connected to a local health program that helped cover her mother's medication, while the case moved forward. It wasn't instant relief. It was enough to breathe. Mark returned to his maintenance work, still tired, still counting dollars, but now with extra shifts offered by people who had once watched silently and now wanted to help. Rex became a familiar sight on the block, children greeting him by name, shop owners leaving bowls of water outside without being asked. On a late afternoon, thick with warmth and fried food scents, Mark sat outside Frank Delgado's diner at a small metal table. Hannah joined him with 2 paper cups of coffee, Rex lying at their feet, his chin resting on crossed paws. No one looked particularly victorious. They looked steady. "We didn't win," Hannah said after a moment. Mark nodded. "No," he agreed, "but we stood." Frank raised his cup in a quiet salute. Around them, the street carried on, cars passing, voices overlapping, life continuing. Nothing was perfect, but nothing was broken beyond repair either, and for the first time in a long while, that felt like hope. Strength is not found in defeating evil, but in refusing to abandon the vulnerable. In our everyday lives, we may not witness loud or dramatic miracles, yet sometimes miracles arrive quietly, when someone chooses to stay instead of walking away, when compassion overcomes fear, and when justice begins with a single act of courage. If you believe that God still works through ordinary people, through open hearts and willing hands, then this story is a reminder that hope doesn't shout, it endures. Miracles don't always fall from the sky. Often, they are born from our choices. If this story touched your heart, please share it. Someone out there may need this hope today. Comment below and tell us what this story meant to you, or simply write Amen if you believe God is our ultimate protector. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories of faith, compassion, and healing. May God bless you and your family, grant you strength when you are weary, light when your path feels dark, and peace in the middle of life's storms. Live with kindness, stand for the vulnerable, and keep believing because hope is still alive.